Hello, BookTube, and today I'm going to be continuing with my sort of library tour. And so I've moved on from my effective, from what I sort of see as my to be read or have been read draw to stuff that's sort of general reading that I haven't got round to or I don't know when I'm going to read. The first one is Puritan's Empire by Charles A. Colon. It says on the cover, a Catholic perspective on American history, so it covers US history from the arrival of Columbus up until pretty much when it was published, which was, double check, I think this was not too long ago, 2008. Charles Colon is a historian, story writer, novelist, public speaker, a sort of raconteur, sort of all-round sort of writer from a sort of Catholic perspective, and he does a sort of weekly show with Vincent Franchini on the Tumblr House channel called Off the Menu. Tumblr House is a publishing company, and they published this, and it's highly entertaining. He gives his views. I don't necessarily always agree with his views, but he's a highly entertaining man and an extremely funny one. And when you watch his videos, you won't be when you watch the videos and listen to him talk, you won't be surprised to learn that he was for some time a stand-up comedian, and because he is extremely funny. But that I haven't got around to reading that yet. But I should. I bought this about 5 years ago, and I haven't yet got around to reading it. So I'm going to have to read it at some point. The next one is a book I actually bought earlier this year, which is called. Just wait a second. So it's The Wild Men. Remarkable Story of Britain's First Labour Government by David Torrance, who's a Scottish historian, and currently I believe he works for the Library of the House of Commons or the Library of the House of Westminster. I'm not sure one or two, but he's an interesting historian, and so I'll look forward to reading that at some point. That was Labour Government, which was in 1924. Next one is The History of Special Branch, which no longer exists. It was abolished in 2007. Well, say abolished, it was split up between several sort of government departments. But it was originally set up in 1883 as the Special Irish Branch to go after what was then Fenian terrorism by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and then it sort of developed into it remained the lead agency on dealing with Irish Republican terrorism right up until it was abolished. It was split up in 2007, but also dealt with Soviet spying, various other kinds of terrorism. So, for example, when people were discovered to be Soviet spies and there was enough evidence to put them on trial, Special Branch were the officers who were sent around with MI5 to arrest them. So that I have read bits and pieces of it. I know some of Special Branch history, but I'm going to read it through at some point properly, because it's a subject I find interesting. It's sort of British intelligence history and British police history is something I find really interesting myself. The next one is one that I got back in February when Sean gave it me. It's an anthology edited by I.F. Clarke on sort of fiction about what people believed was going to be the next war. So from the 1870s up until 1914. So it's got people like, it's got elements of the Battle of Dorking, parts of the Battle of Dorking in the stuff by William Glick, as well as some of the stuff written by German authors and French authors. I think there's one American in here. So that I'm going to read at some point. There's also an article which Jim Chaplin, one of my subscribers, mentioned, which I have got written down somewhere. So when I read this, I'm going to have to read that article as well because it's on the same subject. So I will at some point read this and do a video on it with that article that Jim recommended. The next one is something I actually bought last year, but I still haven't got around to reading it. Unfortunately, it's one of the Argosy libraries. Now, Argosy or Argosy, not sure how it's pronounced. If you do know how it's pronounced, please do tell me in the comments. Was a magazine that published stories in the United States from the 1890s up until 1950s or 60s. And they had a lot of adventure stories, pulp stories, what would become pulp stories. And these are a collection of stories by W. Wirt called When Tigers Are Hunting, and it's a collection of his stories about a mercenary called Cordy. I've read the first story in this, and I enjoyed it, but I'm going to have to go back and read it all the way through. Next one is actually a Commando comic, which I have actually read, which is Did-I Duggan. I've got a video on this on my channel. This, in fact, though this isn't the original copy, this was the first Commando comic I bought, or I should say had bought for me when I was about 6 years old in 1997, or 19, this came out in 96. So yeah, so this would be 96 when I first read this in 96 when I was about 5 years old. And my dad bought it when we were in Wales, just before he got married, I seem to remember. So I enjoyed that then, and when I reread it a month or two ago, I really enjoyed it as well. Commando comics are really good, really enjoyable, sort of quick reads. Very much in the style of 1950s British war films, which is somebody who grew up on those. I'm very happy with. Though I noticed on BookTube, there's a lot of American comics being covered, but very few sort of old-fashioned British ones, particularly Commando comics, which I would honestly say have probably sold more than, let's say, AD 2000, 2000 AD, which is probably the most famous British comic, sort of comic book out. And I reckon Commando almost certainly sold more than them and puts out comics more common than they do. But they're barely ever mentioned on BookTube. So I think I have actually got an omnibus of Commando comics, which I've shown on the channel before, and I'm going to start reading through that to try and give Commando a bit more of a presence on BookTube, so to say. The next one is a book I bought not too long ago. It's the autobiography, the memoir of George Thomas, who was Speaker of the House of Commons in the 1970s and 1980s. Originally born in South Wales, he was a miner, worked in the mines, I believe. Or he was a miner, I think. And he served as a Labour MP, he served as a cabinet minister to Harold Wilson's government in the 60s, Secretary of State for Wales, I believe. And then he became elected Speaker of the House of Commons in the mid-70s, and where he sort of oversaw the Commons during the sort of the Callaghan government, and so the winter of discontent, the IMF intervention, and then finally, of course, Margaret Thatcher's election. And I believe he resigned as Speaker in 1983, so he would have overseen the debates in the early 80s of the early Thatcher government and also the Falklands War. So I'm going to end up reading that as well. I'm not sure when though. Next one is a book which I have actually read, but not for a very long time, but all through I really do enjoy, called Thunderpunt by Jack Higgins, which is the second book in the Sean, let me just see his name, I don't know, Sean Dillon. This is the second book in that. The first book, I seem to remember, had Sean Dillon carrying out a mortar bomb attack on Downing Street on behalf of Saddam Hussein, which was based on a real event that did take place during the First Gulf War, where the Provisional IRA launched a mortar attack on Downing Street when John Major was in there, and there was a cabinet meeting, in fact. And he described as turning Downing Street's garden into something reminiscent of the first day of the Somme. Next one is an interesting book. It's a copy of The Vampire by Dr. Polidori, but I've never seen one in this size, so I'll just open it out to show you. It's got the whole story in. It comes out like this, which I've never seen before, and I've not seen any other Travelman short stories online. I'd love to get some more of these, just because it'd be interesting to see what other ones they have on, especially as they have quite good sort of artwork. You see that there, even though that's meant to be Aubrey, and he looks somewhat older than Aubrey is, and that's meant to be Lord Ruthven at the back there, stood over Aubrey's, well, I suppose, well, it must be Aubrey's sister, but he doesn't look anything like Ruthven as he's described in the book, in the short story. Then there is a history book, an Osprey history. Osprey is sort of British, a British publisher who could publish military matter, military history, uniforms, that sort of stuff. You've probably seen Osprey if you've ever seen those. They usually like this, but they have a green, the green coloured, and they have painted images of soldiers in uniforms, and they'll have them on, say, British Army of 1914, or the German Army of 1939, 1940, that sort of thing. But this is an Osprey. This is a history book, a short history of the Anglo-Irish War. So this covers sort of Irish politics and the sort of terrorism of the original IRA and the Anglo-Irish War from 1913. So as the Home Rule crisis began, well, the year after the Home Rule crisis began, right up until partition. So I am a unionist in my politics, and so I have an interest in that era. More broadly, as somebody has an interest in British political history of that era as well. And the next one is a book I bought would have been roughly this time last year when I was at Sean's, back when he was still in Bedford. A book that I actually first heard about because of a channel called The Cynical Historian, who is an American. He is himself a historian, and he covers all sorts of stuff. Particularly, he does reviews on films covering historical topics, particularly the American West, but also more broadly on US history. And he mentioned this is Gunfighter Nation by Richard Slotkin, which is a part of a trilogy. There's one before this and one after it. And I'd love. Oh, actually, let me just double check. I'm not sure if this is. Let's see, it's actually saying it right. Actually, no. This is actually the third part of the trilogy. The other two are. Let me just get Regeneration Through Violence, and the second book is Fatal Environment. And so Regeneration Through Violence covers sort of the history of the frontier in America from 1600 to 1860, and then the Fatal Environment covers it from 1800 to 1890, and then this one covers sort of the Western, which is sort of the continuation of frontier history into the 19th, from the 19th century, particularly in the 20th century with the Western films, which I'm a big fan of Western films. The next one is another CMAC book, one that I read a couple of months ago, called Way Station. Really enjoyed it. Would recommend CMAC. Though if you're interested in CMAC, I definitely recommend you go over to Shawnee's Standfast channel, because he himself has a store knowledge of in fact I would say he has an encyclopedic knowledge of Clifford D. Simak's work and Clifford D. Simak's sort of life. Next one is another copy of it has the vampire in, but it's got other stories in it, called The Vampire and Other Macabre Tales. So it's got obviously the vampire in, but it has also got other sort of vampire ghost fiction from the early part of the 19th century. So this has sort of vampires and ghost story fiction pre-Victorian era, which I've read. When I did my review of The Vampire back in May, I read it from this because I couldn't actually find that old version. But at some point I'm going to have to go through and read the rest of the stuff in here, because it looks interesting. And also, another vampire one which I read in May is The Black Vampire by Uriah Derek Darcy, which itself is not a particularly good story, but it is interesting in the fact that it's the first black vampire story, it's the first American vampire story, and it was written in reaction to The Vampire by Polidori, and also it's very different sort of vampire, heavily sort of influenced by voodoo and Haitian Revolution, which is a big part of this, and it's very much a contrast with The Vampire, because when you read The Vampire by Polidori, you can see it fitting in with the sort of vampire lore that we have thanks to Bram Stoker's Dracula, whereas this is very different. Now, if you're interested in sort of vampire fiction in general, and particularly older vampire fiction, pre-Dracula, I would recommend it. But if you're just interested in reading vampire fiction for fun, I'd give it a miss. Next one is actually another Simak novel called The Enchanted Pilgrimage, which is actually not a science fiction novel, which makes up most, I think, of what Simak wrote. If Sean sees this, he can correct me if I've got that wrong, but I think I'm right in saying that Simak was very much more, though he did write fantasy, he was very much more heavily more writing science fiction, but it's a fantasy novel. It's an alternate history, a sort of parallel Earth fantasy novel where it's set in what is Wisconsin, I believe, in a parallel Earth where it's still the medieval era, where the Inquisition it's still there. The church is all powerful, and there are also fantasy creatures there like goblins and harpies and hellhounds. Really enjoyable. It's very much lets Simak lean into his strengths of describing landscape. Simak is a wonderful writer when it comes to describing landscape, and you get a lovely lovely succession of different landscapes throughout the book as the characters go on their pilgrimage. So I would recommend that as well. And then the next one is Malcolm Bradbury, the History Man by Malcolm Bradbury, which is a sort of satire on 1970s British academia. Very famous book, made into a very famous and well-regarded BBC TV show. I think it's a 3-part TV series, which I watched and I enjoyed, with Anthony Sher playing Howard Kirk, the main character. They're very much satirising the sort of trendy left-wing attitudes of the era from a sort of liberal humanist position that Malcolm Bradbury was a sort of liberal-leaning humanist and not a fan of the sort of far left, who he's very much satirising in that book. Next one is one book that I was intending to read in April, but I've never got round to, which is the novelisation of Kong, Skull Island by Tim Libon. I saw the film of this, enjoyed it, and so I should enjoy reading this. I may read this month if I get a chance to, as it's a novelisation. It's a bit thicker than the St. Trinian's one. I bought this in the charity shop over the road. Interestingly, this was about £3, and I don't know why. Neither did the lady who served me it. So all the other books I bought, like for example the George Thomas biography memoir that I bought, was only about 50p, and this was £3, and she didn't know why. So, but anyway, I'm going to read that at some point. I will read that. That will be a common refrain through this these different parts of the library. Next one is a book by an author I am a fan of, which is Dennis Wheatley, who's probably most famous for writing The Devil Rides Out. I have a review of the Hammer adaptation of The Devil Rides Out, which is really good. To me, it is arguably one of the best, if not the best, Hammer film ever made. And I would recommend, before you read anything by Wheatley, go and watch that film. If you enjoy the film, you'll definitely enjoy the book, because the film, whilst it's not a completely faithful adaptation of the book, it gets Wheatley on screen, the spirit of Wheatley's books on screen. So if you enjoy the film, you'll enjoy his books. And in fact, this is a sequel to one of Wheatley's other films, which was actually adapted by Hammer, called To the Devil a Daughter, which is the film is all right. To the Devil a Daughter. It's not one of Hammer's best. It's certainly nothing compared to. It's certainly no patch on The Devil Rides Out. However, the book is really good, and this is very much I know this is a sequel to it called The Satanists. The Satanist. Which again, I've not read this. I do want to read this at some point. I may well read this in October for one of the sort of Halloween events that will no doubt be running at the time on BookTube. Now the next one is a book, again, one that I was given by Sean. This I was given, actually the first time I went up and helped Sean, which is the Big Book of Pulps by edited by Otto Penzler. So it's got quite a lot of sort of pulp. It's got a couple of novels in there and plenty of short stories. And so there's sort of pulp, hard-boiled pulp crime stories from, as it says here, the 20s, 30s and 40s. So it has a great cover. That is from Black Mask, which is a very famous sort of crime magazine from the 20s and 30s, of which there are many stories in this that appeared in Black Mask. Next one is an author I want to read at some point, which is a book I bought which I want to read at some point through, which is one of the numerous collections of Sexton Blake, which Mark Hodder put out. Mark Hodder, the author, has written introductions to and chosen. This one is Sexton Blake and the Great War, and this has, I believe, let me just double check. Right. I can't see where I think it says. See if it actually tells me. Sorry about this. I should have checked it. It's got I think it's got a couple of different sort of World War One era stories written as a part of Sexton Blake. There was a sort of ongoing character that went from the 1890s up until the 1960s. Roy Reads Anything has a couple of videos on this. And in fact, it was Roy's videos that prompted me finally to buy this book. And I might have another one possibly. I don't quite know, but at some point I'm going to have to read this as well. It's regarded as very much a working man's or thinking man's Sherlock Holmes, as it were. He's very much more an action-packed figure. And then after the Second World War, sort of in reaction to James Bond, he became more of a James Bond style figure. But these were written from sort of his heyday, which went from the 1890s up until the 1940s. So I'll end up reading that at some point. And also I'll leave a link to Roy's channel down below. Oh yes, here's the app. There we go. Actually, I thought I had another one of the Sexton Blake anthologies, introduced by Mark Hodder. This one is actually the Second World War. So it's Sexton Blake, no doubt investigating spies and German spies and saboteurs in Britain during the Second World War. So again, I'll have to get around to reading that at some point. Next one. Oh, we have a Simak book that Sean gave me when I went up. Yeah, it would have been in February when I went up, called Off Planet, another science fiction novel by Simak. I'm not sure I don't think this is one of the books that Sean has down to be read for this year, but I may be wrong. I'll leave a link to Sean's video setting out the sort of plan of reading in the description for the Simak event. Next one is just a second to get rid of that. So we've got the paint and voice from eBay. It's called Frontier Assault: The North Staffordshire Regiment in the Third Afghan War 1919 by James Green. So I technically live on the border between Staffordshire and Worcestershire. But this is an all Staffordshire regiment, and so it's a local regiment for me. And it's about a war which I have some interest in. It's not very well known, the Third Afghan War. It's a war. People, for example, people are very well aware of the First Anglo-Afghan War because it's the one where you had the retreat from Kabul that ended in a complete disaster and the wiping out of the column where most of the people were killed, and with a handful of survivors being captured by the Afghans, and only one man, an Irish doctor, arriving back at Jalalabad, which was the British fort they were also retreating to from Kabul. It was a very famous painting, I think it's by Lady Butler, called The Retreat from Kabul. And the Second Afghan War is known because that, for example, is referred to in Sherlock Holmes as the war that Dr. Watson serves in. But the Third Afghan War is not very well known at all, and there's not too many books on it. So at some point I'm going to have to read this as well. Because the war, as I say, I'm interested in because there's not much about it. It's a lot like the first Boer War of 1880 to 1881. Everybody knows about the Boer War, the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, and there's a huge amount of books on that. But the first Boer War, there's very little, and I don't quite know why. Because it wasn't because it was significant, and you of course had around the same time the other significant war in South Africa, the Zulu War, of which there's a wealth of knowledge on, a war I'm also interested in for family reasons, but that has a hell of a lot more information on, and that the First Boer War, like the Third Afghan War, is very little on the ground in terms of books and reading. You can find out about it. No, not quite sure why. Right. Next one is it's part of the 20th Century Prime Ministers series. These are small, short biographies of the Prime Ministers of Britain from the 20th century. So it starts with Lord Salisbury, who is my profile pick. If you ever wondered who that was, he was Tory leader from joint Tory leader from 1818, and from 1885 he was sole Tory leader until he resigned in 1902, and then it continues on throughout the 20th century, ending with Tony Blair. And this is Andrew Bont Law, who was leader of the Conservative Party from 1912 to 1921, I believe, and then he came back in 1922, and then became Prime Minister from 1920 to 23, and then died. Interestingly, he is the only non-British born British Prime Minister. He was born in Canada, in I can't remember exactly where, New Brunswick, I believe, to a Northern Irish father who was a clergyman, and then spent some of his childhood in Glasgow. But interesting man. There's a bigger biography of him by the Conservative historian Lord Robert Blake from the 1960s, which is called The Unknown Prime Minister, which I have read, and that's worth a read if you ever get a chance to. And then the next thing is actually to do with the Shadow, or something which I will almost certainly be reading after I have read that Shadow story. Is The Shadow 1941. It's actually called, it's not on the cover here, but I'm not sure if you can read that. It's called Hitler's Astrologer. And it's a comic done by Denny O'Neil, Michael W. Kaluta and Russ Heath. Denny O'Neil and Michael W. Kaluta I know of, but I don't know their work particularly well. But I'm going to be interested to read this because on Rageaholic, Razorfist is very much a great fan of this, and so I'll be interested to read it. Let's have a look. Next one. Right. The next one is P.G. Wodehouse. I've read quite a few P.G. Wodehouses. This one I haven't read for quite a while. I think I read this in 2008, so it's been some time. It's the only Jeeves and Wooster story where Bertie Wooster doesn't appear. So it's just a Jeeves story called Ring for Jeeves. So I read it, as I say, 2008. I seem to enjoy it from what I can remember, but I'll have to reread it at some point. I'm going to have to reread a lot more P.G. Wodehouse because I haven't read Wodehouse for quite a bit. Next one is some Actually, I've got a couple of Goosebumps books that I bought last year, but I didn't get around to reading. So I'm going to have a go at reading these. I should say R.L. Stine books. So we've got Goosebumps, The Beast from the East. Then we've got a Fear Street book called Ghosts of Fear Street: The Revenge of the Shadow People. But I actually saw I did see the Fear Street films on Netflix and quite enjoyed them. I would recommend anybody who's not seen them to watch them, especially the first one, which is really entertaining. And then there's Goosebumps Horrorland. My Friends Call Me Monster, which I remember. I've got to say, as I say, I've never actually read these Goosebumps books, but I do remember I watched the TV series as a kid when it used to be on BBC One. When we used to, back in the days when British TV, both BBC One and ITV, used to have kids' programmes on in the afternoon, which is showing my age. And I remember there was actually a horror, one of the episodes set in a place called Horrorland, where a family goes in and they discover that it's the theme park is full of real monsters, and they have to sort of work their way through it and not get killed by the monsters. Next one is one of which now this is a collected ghost stories of M.R. James. Really recommend M.R. James, great ghost story writer, arguably one of the best. And as a sort of, I might as well do it here now since I've got the book in hand. I am going to be doing an event in December called Ghost Stories for Christmas, where each week we read two M.R. James stories. I've got one co-host. I know who's happy to do it. There's another one I'm going to talk to. I won't mention the names yet. And the stories in question will be chosen by me and the other two hosts, me and the other host, and possibly the third one if that host is able to do it. The name is going to it comes from the fact that in the 1970s, M.R. James's short stories were used to be adapted once a year by the BBC for Christmas, and and in fact they still are done. Mark Gatiss in the past couple of years has done a couple of adaptations of these, and they were sort of put together as ghost stories for Christmas, and so very much inspired by that. That event is going to be sort of reading two ghost stories a week to be chosen, and also I'm also going to try and buy the DVD collections of ghost stories for Christmas, and do reviews of those as well. That they all should say the adaptations are going to be more something I will do. Though almost certainly me and the host, who I definitely know wants to do this, has seen those, so we'll end up discussing the adaptations of the stories that have been adapted if we pick them. So, but anyway, highly recommend M.R. James. Next one. So we have actually another Goosebumps book called Scaredy Cat Specials, which I'm not quite sure what these are. But it looks like it's a games book. Oh, well, I'll have to have a look at that one and look for the Goosebumps books. Not sure why I bought that when it's not actually an actual book to read, but never mind. Next one is a western, which by William W. Johnson, called Radio Eagles. William W. Johnson was he's now no longer with us, but he was a prolific author of westerns. He wrote action stuff. He's very much a Garth August author. And there's a set of books he wrote which are post-apocalyptic men's adventure stories called Out of the Ashes, where a CIA agent who sort of survives the apocalypse, sort of rebuilds the United States, and has to fight off various sort of evil gangs like the Soviets survived. This series is set during the 1980s. It was written during the 1980s, and so the Soviets survive this nuclear war and they try and invade the United States. He has to fight neo-Nazis, black nationalists, all these sort of different groups, as well as mutants and all the horrible creatures. So I'd love to get those, but they're quite expensive. So if I ever do review those on the channel, it'll be when I have more funds available, shall we say. But this one I'll end up reading at some point. It's one of his westerns, which, by all accounts, westerns he was very much on very much his strong point in writing westerns. So it'd be interesting to read that. Next one is The Benson Murder Case by S.S. Van Dyne. This is a The first in the Final Advance series. I bought this because Sean was doing it as a part of his a part of Edgar's book club, where each month he'd read a book. I didn't get around to reading this last year, but I would like reading it at some point because it's described as being the American answer to Lord Peter Wimsey, who I like, by Jonathan L. Sayers. And also, Sean has read this and says it's really good, so I'd like to read it as well at some point. The next one, actually, I've got two books here, both by the same author, both of whom, one of which I have read, and the other which I want to read, which are part of his Arms for Oblivion series, which are both by John Raven. First is Sound the Retreat, which is set in India in the run-up to independence, and you follow a group of British officers, sort of cadet officers, who are attached to their regiments, and sort of their adventures and sort of experiences in India as the British leave. And I read that, and I did really enjoy it. But I read that 10 years ago. So it should be interesting at some point to go back. And this one is actually the first book in the series, called Fielding Grey, which sort of follows one of the main characters, called Fielding Grey, and this is at his public school in his final year. And so I'll be interested to read that as well, because when I read Sound the Retreat, it was as a copy from the library, which was one of the omnibus. There's a section of omnibus edition published about 2010, but they're all in, I believe, they're not in order. So I was a bit confused when I was reading it. So I want to go back and actually buy all the editions in this type, and then read through them. That's a plan for next year. In fact, I'm planning next year to read all of the Arms to Oblivion series, as well as reading Anthony Pole's Dance to the Music of Time, and also C.P. Snow's Strangers and Brothers, because they are all sort of similar in the fact that they follow a group of people throughout British history from the middle of the 20th century up until the late 20th century. So in this case, it goes from 1945 up until 1973, and then Anthony Pole's Dance to the Music of Time goes from the 20s up until the 70s, and then Strangers and Brothers goes from, I think, just before the First World War up until the 1970s. Another Louis L'Amour called Galloway. Again, this was given to me by Sean. It's one of the Sackett novels, which is one of Louis L'Amour's long-running series covering the Sackett family from their arrival in America at the beginning of the 17th century, from I think East Anglia through to the 19th century. So you see them through the whole course of American history. Haven't read that yet. I would like to. I'm going to have to read that at some point, as well as the rest of the Sackett books, when I read North to the Rails, I actually like Louis L'Amour. So the next one. The next one is a book that I've had for some time. It's a pictorial history of the Royal Marines by Peter C. Smith and Derek Oakley. I have read this a couple of times and gone through it, and I enjoyed it. It's very much a sort of general history of the Royal Marines from their establishment as the Duke of York Regiment. I think it was, let me have a look. I can't remember the exact name. In 1664, as the just see if it says here. Bear with me a second. Let me just find out what it says. Sorry about this. I should do. Yeah, that's it. It was the Duke. It was the Duke of York and Albany's Maritime Regiment of Foot in 1664 during the Restoration. So the Duke of York being the future James II, who was, of course, overthrown by the Glorious Revolution in 1689. 1688. And next one is one book which I will be reading in October, is Bram Stoker's Dracula, which which I'm going to look forward to. Read this quite a number of times, always enjoyed it, so I've no doubt when I reread it, I'll enjoy it. Next one is a book I have read a couple of times, I've always enjoyed, and is one of the books which is an influence on James Bond, which is Sapper, Bulldog Drummond by Sapper. Well worth the read. Very much one of the literary forefathers of James Bond. Sorry, my screen's just gone black, so bear with me a second. There we go. And really enjoyable, really good sort of pulpy and veggie story. Very much part of the sort of Clubland Heroes, Imperial Adventure stories, which you also get with Dennis Wheatley's stuff. Particularly his Gregory Salas novels, which are another influence on James Bond. The Richard Hannay books by John Buchan, another influence on James Bond, and also Sax Rohmer's Fu Manchu, which Ian Fleming read and was a fan of, and particularly are influential on Dr. No, which is really an homage to the Fu Manchu novels by Ian Fleming. Next one. So the next one is a book that, again, I want to read again. I've read this before, but I want to read again. It's by Ruth Dudley Edwards. It's called The Seven, The Lives and Legacies of the Founding Fathers of the Irish Republic. So it's about the Easter Rising in 1916 and the men who did it. And as I said before, I'm interested in sort of Anglo-Irish history and particularly the sort of Irish Revolution period of 1912 to 1924. So the next one is another book which I bought from the bookshop in Bedford that I still cannot remember the name of, which is Young Wenceslas. It's about Churchill's journalist dispatches from it says here the Northwest Frontier, the Sudan and South Africa, and you can, if you can see the cover there, it's very much a book brought out as a tie-in with the film Young Winston, which is a film starring Simon Ward, directed by Richard Attenborough, and it covers Winston Churchill's earlier life, adapted from Churchill's memoir of his early life from his childhood up until the book actually goes up until the 1920s, up until the First World War, I think, or until he enters Parliament, which the film definitely covers. Very much worth a watch the film. So it's and sort of you can see it as a tie-in because that there, if I just go closer, that is a picture. That is a depiction of Simon Ward as Winston Churchill. The next one, the books have just fallen over. Just keep that there. Next one is actually a collection of cartoons by Giles, who was a cartoonist for the Daily Express from the 1960s to the from I think the 60s up until 1990s or something like that. So these would appear in Daily Express. This is a collection from the 60s. Let me just read it up. So as you can see, stuff like that, sort of covering the events of the day, which I think for most people on BookTube that wouldn't be interesting, but I have one of the areas of British political history I'm really interested in is the post-war consensus era, which went from the election of the Labour government led by the Labour Party by Clement Attlee to power in 1945 through to the election of Margaret Thatcher heading the Conservative Party in 1979. And so that sort of gives you sort of the popular culture and sort of political culture of the era through political cartoons. The next two are two Black Horse Westerns, which I have read, and in fact I read them for June on the Range this year. One of which is Comanche Moon by Simon Webb, which I enjoyed. That was actually a reread for me. And also Mission to Treaty Mesa by Abe Dancer. I guess I say with Black Horse Westerns, they are very pulpy, very short, but quite enjoyable. The authors usually have written quite a few of them, so they know what they're doing and they understand sort of the brief. So the stories are generally really, really enjoyable. So the last, going near to the end now, not too many. Next one is Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke, which was originally published in 1790, and it's Burke's opinion on the French Revolution and how he believed it would go. And he was quite prophetic. He wasn't a fan of the French Revolution, and he predicted not only the Reign of Terror, which would take place 4 years after the book was published, but also predicted the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, which took place a year or two after Burke's death. And so this book is actually really sort of scarily predicts what will go on in France, and is also the sort of founding document of sort of British and American conservatism. Burke is seen as the founding father of British conservatism, and very much somebody who has, and this book particularly influenced my view of politics. And so it's well worth a read for understanding the attitudes that Britain held in the 1790s and eventually into the Napoleonic Wars, because this was sort of deeply influential, and not only in terms of the sort of long-term effect that this is sort of the founding document for British conservatism, American conservatism, as opposed to the Conservative Party, which is a different beast altogether. An institution that I regard as having had very little to do with actual conservatism for decades, but that's another topic. Anyways, but it's also interesting for giving you an understanding of the attitudes of British thinkers at the time towards the French Revolution. And this book is The Civil War, 1922 to 1923, which is the Irish Civil War by Edward Purdon. It's a very short book, but it gives you a sort of compact, brief general history of the Irish Civil War, which, as I say, is a part of the Irish Revolutionary period, which I'm interested in. The next book is one that I do intend to read again, and I did read before, which is Tom Jones by Henry Fielding. There's a very good 1960s film with Albert Finney playing Tom Jones, and there's also a 1990s TV adaptation with Max Beesley playing Tom Jones, both of which are really enjoyable. And it follows Tom Jones, who's a foundling, and his adventures in England around the time of the 45 Jacobite Rebellion. And it's very bawdy, very enjoyable, and very entertaining. Has quite a few really good characters in it, the standout characters. The next book is one that I haven't read but I know of. I've seen the TV adaptation from the late 80s called, from the late 80s. It's A Piece of Cake by Derek Robinson, and it's about RAF pilots during the Battle of France and Battle of Britain. And it's I've heard a lot of good things about this book, and I really want to read it, but I haven't had a chance to. Next one is a book that I bought, would have been last year when I was at Sean's, but which I haven't got around to reading. It sounds interesting. It's called The Moogle by Thomas Hoover, and it's about an English trader who's a member of the East India Company who goes to India in the very early 17th century, so long before the British come to dominance in India, and he sort of ventures there. The character called Brian Hawksworth, and I'll just read you the back of it. Brian Hawksworth was the English sea captain chosen by the East India Company to open trade with the mighty Mughal Empire. A master of the high seas, a determined ambassador, ruthless manipulator and skilled lover, Hawksworth became a living legend as he journeyed through India. Set in the early 17th century, the Mughal is the thrilling story of a founding dynasty on wealth and splendour far beyond most men's dreams. It is also a story of awesome alliances destined to alter the course of many lives and to change the fate of a nation forever. And it's described here on the back by the Times as a rattling good yarn, and by Good Housekeeping, although I'm not sure what they would give a review, as a great treat. So it says it here also in the best-selling tradition of Shogun by James Cavell. James Cavill, which is, yeah. And I haven't read Shogun, but I have read I've forgotten the name of it now, the one set in around the time of the Iranian Revolution. If you're a fan of James Cavill, Cavill, and you know which one I'm talking about, if you could leave a comment, just remind me, because I really enjoyed that one, but buggered if I can remember the name of it. And the last couple. Let me just get one. Wait a second. So, next two are. So, the next one is The Hounds of Sunset. It's written by Ellis Peters, who's probably most famous for writing the Brother Cadfael detective stories, which are about a medieval monk who solves crimes. This one isn't one of those. This is set. It's covering another series. This is actually the third book in the series. It's about. It's set about a century before. No, it's actually set at. Let me just think. I'm just trying to work out from what I remember about medieval history. It was. No. This is set a century after the Cadfael books. And it's set in, by the look of it, just as Edward the First takes over, so that would be 1272. So this is, as I say, set just at, well, more, as it actually said, about 120 years after the Cadfael books. But it's set in Wales, and I don't think, by the look of it, it's a detective story. It looks like it's a sort of adventure war story about Edward the First and Prince Llewellyn of Wales, which I won't read this until I've got the other books, and then I'll read through it, because I've read a couple of the Cadfael books and really enjoyed them. So Ellis Peters writing books, writing about that sort of stuff, Edward the First and Llewellyn. It should be really interesting. Then we have Alistair MacLean, The Last Frontier, which I've not read, but I do know vaguely about it, where it's about a British agent sent into Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution to get an agentate. And whilst I haven't read this, I have read other Alistair MacLean books, so Guns of Navarone, Where Eagles Dare, For Whom the Bell Tolls. No. Eight Bells Toll. When Eight Bells Toll. And then it's Dark Cruiser, and also Satan's Book as well. Oh yes, and Isolation Zebra. All of which were turned into really good films, which I highly recommend. So I know that I will enjoy that, because I enjoy Alistair MacLean full stop. And then the last, actually 3 books, all of which I have read, but which I'm going to reread at some point in the next, probably before the end of the year or beginning of next year. One is Carpathian Castle by Jules Verne, which is a sort of horror story. It is described as a gothic horror story, and it's very much it's vampire. It's described as a vampire story, zombie story. It's also very much a science fiction story as well. It's well worth a read, and as I say, I'm going to reread that at some point. And these two are both by the same author. In fact, they're both in the same series. First, both by Guy N. Smith, who sadly died in 2021, but he was sort of a legendary, British pulp author, and wrote, probably most famously, the Crab books. So the first one of which is called The Night of the Crabs, and this called The Black Fedora, following a sort of counter-terrorism operative who was infiltrating a group of hippies with ulterior motives, and it involves the occult. And then this is its sequel, called The Satanic Armageddon, which involves Satanists and Islamic fundamentalists. Which it is enjoyable. Guy N. Smith isn't the greatest author in the world, but he does tell a good story, like Dennis Wheatley in that way. And I remember there was one of these other stories which I've got to read at some point, where a voodoo god possesses somebody, and then the person goes back to Wales and tries to take over the British nuclear weapons site. I think it's a place inspired by Milford Haven, And then there's another one called the Satan Bell, or the Demonic Bell, where every time this particular bell, which is sort of satanically sometimes satanic element to it, every time it's rung, it causes people to go insane and do unspeakable things. And it's very much in that vein, and it's not necessarily the most serious things in the world, but they are really enjoyable, and that was enjoyable as well. I want to read more sort of Guy Smith as well. So that's that draw done. The next part will be the drawer under here, which has got quite a few books, and then finally I will end with my books in my bookcase. So I will see you tomorrow for the next part of the sort of library tour.